Hello, everyone. So, with pre-patch, only about a few weeks away now. It's on January 20th. I'd like to kind of go over where Annihilator and Void Scarred are kind of sitting on the beta right now. Which ones are kind of strong and which one not to take, or, kind of just how are we sitting going into the last kind of phases of beta here. Something important to keep in mind is that beta performance is not going to reflect pre-patch performance because of things like you're not going to have your Apex talents on pre-patch. So, like, Collapsing Star won't always crit. You're not going to get the Collapsing Star is going to be a lot weaker than it will be at 90. Most importantly, you're not going to get that free C star when you activate Void meta. And then you're not going to have the 3 points in your hero talent tree. Um, but this isn't super hampering to either spec, but I'll kind of go over that in a minute. The thing to recognize with Void Scarred and Annihilator that's going to, at least if stat weights and builds and things, if those all stay the way that they are currently, the big thing to recognize is the stats for these two specs is basically totally flip-flopped. Void Scarred is a heavy lean on mastery. I'm in my Void Scarred gear and I have I'm at a very high amount of mastery with 1200 in the stat. I have about 15% natural haste. This, I think I'm getting like 1% because I'm a night elf at night. Um, but this is the biggest thing for these two. Crit and verse are always going to be bad. I have almost no verse. Crit, I have a little bit, but these two stats are not really worth thinking about. And obviously, you should sim your character when you're actually gearing up. But Void Scarred gets its damage from taking mastery gear. If you're going, if you're playing what we were playing with, like these full haste, super haste stack annihilator builds, you're not gonna do even close to the same amount of damage or even any better when you're playing Void Scarred because you just aren't geared for it. Void Scarred wants to sit at about 15% haste because that's where that kind of like get another C star in Void meta breakpoint is. So like that's kind of where you want to sit with that, and that's not really hard to do. There's a lot of haste I'm just wearing gear that is pretty inconsequential in the beta right now just to get the stats where I wanted them to be. But there's plenty of haste mastery rings and things like that. Like this stat spread is definitely achievable with reasonable gear. And then Annihilator is what we've kind of already talked about, like this super haste stack, and it might get a little bit of like it doesn't mind having the extra mastery on some of its pieces as long as they're like heavy haste. But the big thing obviously is like how much damage. Well, what's the damage difference? Because we're gonna have people, and I'm sure there's some people watching that you don't like the melee builds or you don't like the range specific builds, and I'll swap to ranged Annihilator really quick. And this is just the Mythic Plus build, I believe. Um, but really the only point difference is a point in Eradicate goes into Void Glare Boon, and then this point in Doomsayer goes into Harness the Cosmos. Like that's really the only difference. Um, but the ranged builds, I would say, are not behind enough to completely count them out. I think it'd be kind of unreasonable to just say, "Oh, Annihilator's dead," because it just isn't. It is decently behind Void Scarred. It's, I want to say about 5%. It's a little with Sims and everything, but that's about the gap that you're working with, I would say on average. But it isn't something, and that's on single target. Void Scarred is very strong in AOE, and that's kind of its main strength. But that isn't to say like during beta and during pre-patch you shouldn't still be trying Annihilator. On pre-patch, like I'm pretty sure in pre-patch Void Scarred's going to annihilate. no pun intended, because of things like void surges and a less reliance on collapsing stars, where like Annihilator has otherworldly focus. But I'm gonna make a pre-patch guide that's gonna kind of cover all of those things, sort of in detail. But just kind of moving forward, when thinking about like these two specs, thinking of them one next to another, I suppose. Uh, I think gameplay wise, they're actually in a pretty good spot. And I mean, we've talked about things like rebuffs and stuff like that. Beyond just our wish list of like rebuffs and like C Star not taking souls when it gets canceled, I'm actually really happy with if I want to play a ranged build, I still have that sort of interactivity going on. Like I'm not just like getting my whole rotation gutted because I don't have Hungering Slash in the hunt and I'm not pressing Void Blade. I'm still benefiting from gameplay loops from Voidfall that allow me to, cast in reaps here and there. And I still am, and I'm also not, forced into melee to do certain mechanics. And I still think it'll be very similar, especially after I did the rate testing. I still think it'll be very similar to how Mana Forge Omega worked out for Havoc, where you have this basically split between your two hero talents of, oh, this hero talent's really good on this fight, and then you swap for this other fight. And I think that's kind of the happy medium we want to sit with, because I don't think it's super healthy for the game to have one hero talent be super prevalent over the other one for very long periods of time. I'm not entirely opposed to one hero talent spec being the best for a season. I'm not super opposed to that. But when you have things like Herald of the Sun Ret, where Herald of the Sun was only used for 1 week in season 1 and it got bug fixed. It was only because of this bug it was good. And then it was completely terrible, irrelevant for the entire rest of the expansion. That is, I'm not scared for that. I'm not really scared for anything. I know there's a lot of dooming. There's a lot of uncertainty, especially with a new specialization for a class that already exists. I think that's something too. But it's different from Aug because Augmentation didn't have the testing that Devourer does. So things were kind of had to get made up on the fly, and there wasn't as much testing, and it ended up being really overpowered. And with Blizzard wanting to kind of avoid that scenario, there's totally a chance that Devourer isn't super Giga S tier at the start of the expansion or for the whole expansion. I mean, we can't know, and it's not good to really dwell on those things and think about those things long term. Just enjoy the spec. And I think Annihilator and Void Scarred on their own are allowing us to, make those distinctions between the two playstyles that even if Annihilator is 5% behind, as long as you're not, as long as Void Scarred isn't massively ahead, which some might say 5% is massively ahead, but I mean, it's kind of just how you look at it for certain content. We're still kind of in that balanced section of between the two. And I'm really happy with that. I don't have a lot of complaints for that because I have played, as you all know, I have extensively played both of these hero talents on beta, even when Void Scarred we thought was like, granted, it was still really bad before. I mean, even if you stacked Mastery before the Void Surge buff, it probably still wasn't good because Void Surges just didn't do any damage. Like, even when I was testing it when Void Surges didn't do any damage, I still had a ton of fun because, if I was, getting annihilated, again, no pun intended, by a mechanic on one boss as a Void Scarred, I could just swap to Annihilator and, stick to ranged a little bit more and make that fight a little easier for me. So I think as long as we're staying on the path of tuning that we are, I think we're in a really good spot for, picking your poison between Annihilator and Void Scarred. Now in Mythic Plus, Void Scarred does do a lot more AoE damage. This mostly kind of comes down to like it's much more on demand when you get into a meta, that is. outside of meta, and this is kind of the whole reason Void Scarred works with Mastery so well, is our Mastery, yeah, I'm doing 40% more cosmic damage with that Mastery, but then it's increased by that additional 48% in meta, so those Void Surges are just doing massive amounts of damage. But outside of meta, those Hungering Slash, like Void Blade combos, they're not doing a whole ton of, I mean, they'll do okay, but they're not, like, doing, like, an obscene amount of damage or anything like that. So I think just to kind of close out, um, I think just to kind of close out, you know, there will be a best between these two for specific things, and it could honestly end up being that Void Scar's just the best in all content, or it could be Annihilator's the best in all content. But at the end of the day, I think it's really important for people to still do their own research and to do their own sims to figure out, okay, well, Void Scar's better in every, let's say Void Scar's the best in all content, but I did my own sims and Annihilator is simming, 2% behind Void Scarred in pure single target with my gear. I can probably safely play Annihilator and not play, Void Scarred, which I don't like as much. And you can literally flip those two scenarios around and it's exactly the same answer. But for now, thank you for joining me again in Darnassus. I'm loving Darnassus on the beta because it's nice and empty and quiet. But I will have a pre-patch video out probably the day of pre-patch. I'll be working on that sort of when I can. But in the meantime, I will still have content coming down the pipeline. Didn't upload anything on Wednesday because it was the holidays. So, but for now, I will see you all later.